Okay, so let's keep talking about network exploits here. One of the things that we did earlier in the semester, for those of you that remember, is we had everybody try to ping the teacher station and see if we could sort of do a denial of service attack on that computer in the lab. There's a couple different ways to do denial of service attacks, and that one is pretty much the most straightforward one, where you just get a whole bunch of computers, ideally, or to try to just overwhelm something with network traffic. This is referred to as kind of a volume-based DOS attack. There's also ones that have to do with protocols. If you have a protocol-based DOS attack, then what this is going to do is it's going to try to take advantage of the way that protocols work to impact a system in some way. And then there can be something that's referred to as an application layer DOS attack. And if you're doing an application layer DOS attack, that's designed to actually try to crash either an application or a service that's running through some sort of manipulation of packets. Now, the book has a brief discussion of tools that can be used for this. There is not surprisingly a Metasploit way you can do this that lets you sort of manipulate SYN packets. The other thing that the book mentions is a tool that is allegedly sort of included with Kali Linux that's referred to as hping. And if you do what I imagine most of you have a tendency to do here, which is to go and type hping, what you're going to see is that this is not found. But hping 3 is an updated version of this, and if you type hping 3, that's going to go ahead and just launch you into hping, and there's some things you can do at that point. If you want to know more about it, you can just go ahead and do man hping 3, and it'll get you the man pages. And I think we've all talked about what man pages are. If you've been through the Linux class, if that's new information to you, if you type man and then the name of a command, will bring up the user manual for that command. So you can go use Google if you'd like to, but if you just type man hping 3, should give you a whole lot of information about that. hping is a tool that will let you construct packets in a certain way to use in DDoS attacks, or DOS attacks rather. So there's a couple other sort of types of attacks that the book mentions in here that are sort of specific to Windows services, and the first one is NetBIOS. Now, NetBIOS is a protocol that's used in sort of Windows networks pretty frequently, and sort of there are some vulnerabilities that this has that can be used sort of to trigger various exploits here. And one of the things that is important to understand is how NetBIOS's name services resolve. And the book gives you a sort of a three-part step here, but you can see that steps 2 and 3 both have two steps within them. So there's a little bit going on here, probably more than just 3 bullet points would give us the idea that something would seem to indicate. And there's a couple slides here. We're on about page 237 if this is something that you would like to take a look at. But this explains how NetBIOS actually resolves names, and how you can actually manipulate this to do something that will get you information. Now, NetBIOS attacks in general aren't particularly interesting in and of themselves. Just doing one of those is not going to grant you as much access to the system as you would probably hope. But if you remember from the last chapter when we were talking about chained attacks, a NetBIOS attack might give you information about the system that you can use to turn around and exploit the system in some other way. That's the real value of this. There's also a list of ports, and it's probably good to have some passing familiarity with these. And the book mentions a tool called Responder, which is a way that lets you. It's a tool that's included with Kali that lets you sort of exploit NetBIOS and LLMNR, which is one of the steps. If you were to go back to a couple slides back, it's one of the last steps that NetBIOS uses for name resolution. So if this is something that you were interested in looking at, you can launch this by just typing responder. And you've got to spell it right, responder here. And you can see that this looks like it's trying to launch, but it doesn't actually launch here. It says that gives us a something's missing here. So what I'm going to do is type responder -H. Now -H by default in a lot of Linux programs pulls up the help file. So you can use the man page if you want to, of course, by just typing man responder with a space in between them. But if you type responder -H, it's going to give you an example of the sort of thing that it's expecting and sort of the things that it can do. To go back to where we were in the slideshow, the book has a couple of examples of what responder looks like when it's running and what it looks like when it's capturing packets. So those are both things that are sort of worth knowing. One more thing that's worth knowing here is anytime you're going to be using some sort of NetBIOS exploit, you're likely to be using this on a Windows network. And the book has some examples of various commands that you can use. It refers to as Windows net commands. These are on the bottom of page 239. And what I'd encourage you to do is to type a couple of these into your computer. Now, probably not going to work exactly like the book says they are, because this depends on you being sort of as part of a Windows network. So this computer that you're looking at right now is something that was issued to me by Calhoun, and it's supposed to be on the Calhoun domain. But obviously, I am not at Calhoun right now. I'm at my house where we are not on the Calhoun domain. I'm not VPN'd in. I'm just using this as if it's a normal computer. So some of these things, if I say net user domain, you can see that it's trying to access this sort of by looking at this and the Calhoun network, and it can't do it. So this is what we're seeing right here. If you have a Windows domain set up in your house, some of these are going to be a lot more interesting than what you're going to be seeing here. This is something that's supposed to give me sort of all the shares that are SMB shares that we're using. If I type net session, this gives me a list of all the sessions that are currently being used with SMB. Right now, as you can tell, there aren't any. But if you are on a Windows network, and when I get back to Calhoun, if you were to run these commands in the lab, probably get something that's marginally more interesting than what you would see there. So the next couple things that we're talking about are just sort of common services that aren't specific to Windows. And there's SNMP and then SMTP is the one that gets talked about right after this. And anytime I have to say those back to back, I get myself in trouble. So heads up, if I get them wrong, then just sort of be aware that might happen. It's been a long day. SNMP is a protocol that can be used for gathering information about what's on a network. And because of this, this is something that is a potential weakness that you could possibly exploit, because this is something that's designed to give and get information. So one of the things that's probably the most important thing that you should know when you're trying to sort of execute an SNMP exploit is what version of SNMP you're dealing with here. So there is as seems to be the case with a whole bunch of protocols, the older versions are going to have less security that's less robust than newer versions. So there is I know this is going to be a shock to everybody, a tool in Kali that will let you sort of futz around with SNMP if you'd like, and that is, let me do this so my big face isn't in the way. SNMP walk is a command that lets you take a look at this. Now, SNMP walk expects to see a whole bunch of arguments after that, so it gives us essentially the help file after telling us that it's not going to work because we didn't tell it what we wanted it to execute this on. So now, if you look at the command that's in your book, it's page 242, and it actually is using v1. Now, that is probably not likely to work if you were trying to execute this on your home network, because I would bet that most of you have newer systems in your house and they are probably not still using version 1, which means what you're using probably has fewer vulnerabilities than the output than what you would see in the book. But this is still something that would be worth messing around with and taking a look at if you want to learn more about it. So that's probably about all we need to talk about with SNMP. Now, STMP is something that's a little bit different. STMP is going to be a protocol that's used for sending email. Now, I think one of the things that we did earlier in the semester when we were doing ethical hacking was we used Telnet to connect to a port on a mail server and see if we could sort of get information about it that way. I believe that was actually POP that we did that with, which is something that is more commonly used to receive email instead of send it. But STMP is sort of the protocol that works in the other direction. If you were sending information from a computer and you're not using some sort of webmail, it's very likely that you're using STMP. Because STMP is something that uses information about, it depends on users that are already logged onto the system and have accounts in most ways that it's set up. So there are ways to try to use Telnet to connect to an STMP server that would allow you to confirm that users exist on that server, for example. There are some Metasploit things for this, but I don't think there's any standalone programs that you'd need to know about. FTP exploits are generally a little bit more easy to exploit if somebody's still using FTP, but that part's rare. FTP, remember, sends its passwords in plain text, so if you're sniffing packets, you can probably get a login, but remember that can just get you into the FTP server. It doesn't necessarily give you free run of the rest of the operating system most of the time. There is a bug in some versions of FTP and some FTP servers and exploits you can run that would actually let you sort of jump out of the directory that FTP is designed to let you see in. And sort of, so for an example, if I was running an FTP server on my Linux machine, I might put its root directory in, say, /share/FTP, and if somebody gets into the FTP server, that's the directory that they can see. I can be pretty confident that they're not seeing what's in my home directory because that's in /home/gsmith. If you're able to use an FTP exploit that lets you jump out of that directory, you might be able to get into other places on the system. So that's why that's something that could be a potential problem. Now, a couple other things here, and then we'll talk about wireless attacks in the last video. SMB, a lot of these acronyms are pretty similar, and if you try to say them, you're going to get yourself into some trouble. But SMB is something that this actually gets talked about twice in this chapter because it's something that's a Windows vulnerability, and then we're talking about it here again because it's a Linux vulnerability. This is SMB always refers to Samba, and there can be sort of SMB refers to sort of ambiguous, either SMB on Windows or Samba on Linux, but both of these are designed to sort of connect to the network in the same way. They use the same protocol and they use the same ports. And whatever version you're dealing with, if this is Linux or this is Windows, there's a potential for some vulnerabilities there. They're not necessarily going to be exactly the same though, so you may have to do some sort of analysis of what you're getting back from the system just to see what OS you're dealing with before you jump into trying to exploit that. Now, SSH, as we've mentioned a couple times already, is designed to be a replacement for Telnet, but it's something that could still be exploitable depending on how it's set up. So there are some Metasploit models for this, and there's also a program that's referred to as Hydra. So if you want to access that in Kali, you can just type Hydra, and it's going to give you a whole bunch of information about what that looks like. This is an example of how you would use Hydra and what you would sort of expect it to do. So but Hydra can be used for a couple things. You can see that it's doing something with an FTP server in the example. It's on the screen now. It can also be used to brute force SSH. So be aware of what that is. Okay, so that's it for this. The last thing that we'll talk about is wireless attacks, and that's going to be its own little video. It should be shorter than this one. I think that's what we're all hoping for.